Okay, welcome back everybody. We are going to start our next session, and in this session we're going to be talking about all things data. So joined up and responsive, how to use data to drive better services. And the issue of data has already come up. It came up in the last session as one of the foundations that you need in place to be able to maximize the potential of AI, for example. So we're going to be covering things like how do you manage data, how do you get the right governance in place, how do you make sure that data is kept secure, what's working well. I know there's a data strategy here in Canada. Any questions you have about data, this is the session in which you should ask them. So we're going to follow the same format. I'm going to do a quick introduction to our brilliant speakers here today, and then I'm going to ask them a couple of questions and then throw it open to make this your session. So please do be thinking about the questions and the comments that you want to put to the panel as we go through. So in terms of our panel, from the end here towards me, we have Gabrielle Fitzgerald, who is the Chief Data Officer for the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. Then we've got Ima Okni, who is Assistant Deputy Minister and Chief Data Officer at the Employment and Social Development Canada. We have Dr. Melvin Greer, who is Fellow and Chief Data Scientist for the Americas at Intel. We've got Michael Langton, who is Senior Director of Advanced Analytics and AI for North America at Converge Technology Solutions. And we've got Gayen Perez, who is Head of Data and Technology, Chief Digital Officer at the United Nations Development Programme. So it's great that we have a fantastic mixed audience here today, panel here today. I'm going to kick off with the first question, and I'm going to put it to you, Gabrielle. So the first question really is about to provide services to the public. So departments and agencies have to get better at sharing their data. And what are some of the ways you think we can help to facilitate a better sharing of data across some of those traditional boundaries?
Thanks very much. And I'm sure I'm not the only one in this panel that would have an opinion to this. But when we think about data and we think about how we pull these pieces together, obviously services need to be tailored. They need to be tailored to the needs of the client, the citizen, the user. And for us to do that, we need to understand, the user experience. We need to understand what their information requirements are. We need to understand those building blocks. And we need to do that with data. But how do we do that? By understanding those clients without overburdening them and overburdening them with that information that we need. And so one of the things, and one of the things because as part of this effort that we do within the federal government, under the federal data strategy, it's looking at those building blocks to think about, the governance, the structures, the pieces. And if we think about those efforts, we want to take the information from citizens, we want to take the information from clients, and we want to ask once, use many. I'm sure people have heard this before around, that aspect and the idea around making sure that it's reusable, it's shareable, it goes beyond those efforts. So whether it is, in the Canadian context at a federal or provincial or municipal or Indigenous or other sort of ways of sharing information, what we need to be thinking about is we need to be thinking about it in a transparent and open by default effort. And to think about how to create those different services, oftentimes I have seen in the history of what I've done, in my jobs, is we get data for a singular purpose. We get it for a program, we get it for a project, and we use it for those pieces. And what happens is that maybe another program might need that data, but just in a nuanced, slightly nuanced way, and they'll ask for the same data. And what we need to do is we need to break those barriers down, and we need to be building that actually more cohesively and thinking about, reusing so that we don't ask for it multiple times. How to do that and where do we think about those pieces? We need to understand, and from my perspective, how do we think about the federal efforts for a data scan. What is the data? What's its purpose? What programs is it being used for? So understanding that what. And then understanding the when. When can we use it? So that how the data is shared, under what conditions, how do we need to be thinking about the privacy and the security of that information? And of course we need to be thinking about how. We need to have a framework around this. We need to be thinking about its structures, the data sharing agreements, any other types of waivers. If anybody has ever, in the federal context, has ever shared data with Statistics Canada, for instance, as our primary data holder for all economic, social, or environmental statistics, you have to have waivers of how you use it, what you use it for, that context, because when you lose that context, you may lose the understanding of what that data and its purpose was. And then of course how. We need to be thinking about the structures. We need to be thinking about the automated approaches, the infrastructure for that we can query the information, we can get that information, and we can use it in multiple ways. And so I think that we need to also move away from some of the risk pieces. And so I work at the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, and we're a regulator. So as a regulator, we look at risk. And so in a risk culture, how do we make sure that we share information so that there's a lot of that back and forth, and wanting to make sure that it is that open by default where possible. And if we think about that, what we need to be doing is we need to be starting at the forefront of when we want to develop or build that data. So the legislation or the regulation or the way that we want to be building that data ingestion, we need to be thinking about it so that we're not building it with a very singular purpose, or we're not pigeonholing ourselves in what we've been collecting, so that we have an understanding of the conceptual data models, we understand the relationships, the attributes, those pieces, so that the data can talk to each other and can be interoperable. And the more we do that, and the more we think about these data sharing frameworks, the more we can use it towards that citizen development and services side.
Brilliant, thanks Gary. I mean, you've covered lots of issues there, I think, but thinking about when you're commissioning data, when you're using data, what's its purpose, how can it be reused, thinking about the framework and the governance of that data from the very start so that it can be shared more broadly, and the what, the when, and the how. And you mentioned on the how as well, the security kind of consideration. So building on that, Melvin, my question to you, and the issue of kind of security has come up already this morning as well. Do you think it's possible for public servants and civil servants to maximize the use of data, to share it widely, but also keep it safe and keep it secure? And how do they get that balance right?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I'm really actually starting off by saying I'm happy to be at my second AccelerateGOV. I was at the first one, now I'm at the third one, so maybe I'll be at the fifth one, I don't know. But this question is really important because not only am I a fellow and chief data scientist at Intel, but I'm also a fellow and a government employee. I'm a fellow at the FBI. And so the Federal Bureau of Investigation in the US. And so it's really important to think about two things. One, privacy and security is not the enemy of innovation and sharing data. In fact, I would argue that the ability to secure and be really clear about how you're going to share data is an accelerant for innovation in government. And the reason I say that is because the more transparent one is, especially when it comes to the intersection of data sovereignty and data governance, the better people like it. The better people are interested in trusting the data. The better people are interested in trusting the solution that the data is generating. So that's pretty much an important aspect of this whole conversation. I think second, there's some basic blocking and tackling that needs to be done. We need to figure out how to do great encryption, access control, and access management as part of a data governance strategy is foundational. But there are two other areas that I'm really interested in focusing in on that might be of interest. And I think the first one is providing this minimalistic view of how data is going to be collected and shared. And having a minimalistic view, we're seeing already a trend away from the highest, largest language models that can be created to small language models that are focused on a function and that are able to be managed discreetly and that don't require more data than is required in order to solve the problem that we're trying to solve for. Secondly, when we talk about transparency and being in a position to ensure that data privacy and security doesn't compromise innovation, and we heard a little bit about that earlier when we talked about the kinds of people who are now participating. At Intel, you'll see that many of the solutions that we create are not born out of just technologists like me, but we've hired anthropologists, ethicists, sociologists, community leaders. These are the people who are able to help us define the nuances associated with data sharing and ensure that we're not violating not legal restrictions, not legal impacts, but common sense ones. The litmus test that often is used is, if this were my mother and father's data and they didn't know it was going to be shared, how would I feel about sharing it?
Thank you so much, Melvin. I really like what you say about getting the basics right, so making sure all of those things are done, but also taking that minimalistic view. So do you need to share all of this data, or what data you're actually going to need for the objective that you're working on? And fascinating that you're saying bringing in other professions like sociologists and anthropologists to be asking those questions around, would people mind if we shared this data? So that's, you're not even touching on regulations there, which I think has come up, but kind of just some of those very basic questions. And I wrote down here, privacy and security are not the enemy of innovation. So maybe the audience has some thoughts on whether it feels like that from where they are currently sitting. Thank you so much, Melvin. Emma, I'm going to come to you. So we've heard there about ways in which data is being shared, and I think it's safe to say during COVID, we saw quite a lot of innovation in the way data was used and shared. Do you think there is a risk now, in terms of what you are seeing, that we are going back to old ways of being a bit too cautious and a bit more risk averse?
No, thank you for the question. I just wanted to start first by really thanking the organizers of this event. I'm really happy to be in a session where we're talking about data. I haven't heard AI yet, and we still have a lot of people in the room, so it's good to see that, because as we know, data is a driver for AI. So I'll go into the question. During the pandemic, it became extremely clear that we needed to share data. So share data in multiple fronts. So for example, for us to be able to really deliver benefits to Canadians who were losing jobs like very rapidly because of the shutdowns, we needed to understand the composition of the population. So we needed to understand what the different demographic segments were of the population. So again, it was important for us to work with Statistics Canada to really understand some of those segments that were losing jobs quickly. And if you go on Statistics Canada's website today, you'll see a whole plethora of reports that really showed who was impacted and what industries were impacted. And the only way we were able to do this was through data linkages, which required data sharing. And in terms of some of the work we did really fascinating work in terms of understanding that it wasn't just the federal government that needed this data, it was also the provinces, because the provinces needed to share the data. So as the pandemic progressed, what we found was the legislation had basically handcuffed us from sharing some of this data with the provinces. And this wasn't the Privacy Act. It was actually the organizational acts that hindered us to share this data. So we understood that the provinces needed to know, if citizens in their provinces needed extra supports, if they needed to plan for things like the reopening of offices and things like that, daycares and all that. So we changed the legislation. We had to work within the protocols and within the frameworks to actually rationalize changing that legislation to enable that data sharing. So one of the things I learned from that experience is oftentimes data people talk to data people. Now AI people want to talk to AI people, but everybody needs to talk to everybody. Because what I learned was when legislation is being drafted, it is very rare to see people working on data in the room. And what happens is the legislation is crafted in a way that hinders the art of the possible with data. So by us understanding during the early days of the pandemic that we needed to be in that drafting room in order for us to help enable, create that enabling legislation, we were able to actually change it and do more things with data. So I think my big aha moment from that is that we often go to the Privacy Act, or we talk about things like, we're worried about sharing that data because Canadians will basically not be happy with us sharing that data, but we've actually handcuffed our own selves in the way we craft legislation, in the way we've organized our structures and our culture, where we're very, very almost like hesitant about sharing data. And we proved during the pandemic that it was possible to share that data. We also proved that we could do it in a way that was ethical, in a way that really stood the test of the Privacy Act, and we delivered to Canadians that most needed it.
Thank you. So really interesting about how you sometimes need to change the legislation, but I get the lesson there is in future, make sure that we are creating new legislation in a way that won't hinder data sharing as well. But you also, mirroring what others have said, the importance of collaboration, of working across professions, so AI people with data people, but also with the lawyers, with the legal team in the room as well, really, really important. Thanks so much, Emma. Michael, I'm going to come to you. So you're slightly different. You work with agencies as well, but like Melvin, you work with agencies across the public sector. So just what are you seeing in terms of what's working well when it comes to data sharing, and where are some of the biggest barriers?
Yes, thank you. So this is my second AccelGov event, and thinking about the conversations this morning and the previous panel, the progress that AI has been sort of something taken with a bit of fear and trepidation to today everybody's comparing notes on what they've actually done is pretty incredible. To me, data and AI are really two halves of the same coin. I agree with Emma completely that data, or AI is driving data. Having a data conversation intrinsically with leadership is a little bit technical and plumbing oriented versus putting AI in front of the conversation really allows to connect the objective with a citizen journey to actually the underlying data. I was chatting with Emma as we were getting set up, and she was talking about COVID and the impact in terms of innovation. And we've seen some, I'll call it really interesting, I'll call it forced innovation because of COVID. We're working with, I'm from Toronto, and I'm with a company called Converge, which is the largest company that most people in the room have never heard of. They're a Canadian company, about $4 billion traded on the stock exchange. One of the projects I was involved with was with Access Employment, which was about connecting new immigrants to Canada to their future professional development in Canada and all the resources. The problem with that organization is it was an in-person service, and COVID basically shut the doors on that. So coming into Canada, let's say with an engineering or healthcare background, I wouldn't have the way to communicate. Perhaps language isn't, English wouldn't be strong enough. And so we actually built some things for them around AI a couple of years ago that allowed those individuals to be able to work in a self-service manner. So we built something, our AI engine under a chatbot called Vera, really maps out the citizen journey. And it's something that we're seeing with agencies, and we're working at the federal, provincial, state, local in the US, and municipal level, is mapping through design thinking workshops the citizen journey. When people talk about the applications for data and analytics and AI, both of which are things that I am responsible for, we start with, let's map out how our citizens interact with this. Last year, the CIO from the United States was presenting at the keynote, and you can correct me for anyone that was there. I think the amount of services that are recorded and available digitally to US citizen was well under 10%. I wanted to say somewhere between 5 and 8%. So rather than data and AI analytics for its own sake, we like to think about it as let's go through the process as a citizen to interact with the government, map out that process, work that to what is the business problem, the organizational challenge that we're trying to solve, and then bring that back through the entire data and governance cycle. So we're seeing some really exciting things now. I think things like Copilot, which is the UI for AI, is now creating awareness with leadership now that they're touching it for the first time and seeing the productivity gains that it can give them on a daily basis, recording meetings, setting up agendas, and basically making them productive. Now we can have analytics conversations, because calling on leadership to say, we'd like to have a 2-day working session on data governance is probably not going to work very well. But connecting that back to how we're going to connect the citizen journey back through those layers is really exciting. And again, the progress we've seen in the last year has just been incredible, and I can't wait for next year's session, hopefully to see AI and data really become the forefront of the public sector.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, it's moving so fast that 1 year after, 1 year on, there's going to be a lot of changes. So I think, so what you're saying, there are lots of innovation happening, which is good to see, but maybe more could be done in using insights from data to drive kind of understanding of the customer journey. And going back to what Melvin was saying, you're saying now that people are starting to use some of these, the analysis and some of the new technology, and it's working well for them, then you can start to have wider conversations. A bit like Melvin was saying, if people have a great service from government, they're more likely to trust you with their data than if they have a bad experience. So we'll be coming to the audience after this final question from our speakers, so be thinking about your questions. But Gayan, I want to ask you, so from the UN perspective, can you give us some examples of maybe where governments around the world who you kind of work with are doing this well?
Sure. So just to add a bit of context to that question, I work for United Nations Development Program, the development arm of the UN, and we are present in over 170 countries, serving 194 member states. So we are not too different from a government from that perspective as well, and both internally, the way we work with data, and also how we advise governments on their data. The governments that do well have taken a principles-based approach into data, because this is such an evolving field. Today we are talking about AI, there's low Earth orbit satellites, blockchain, tomorrow it'll be some new technology. So when things are evolving that fast, it's important to have those principles right. And data, all systems, public services are built on trust, accountability and transparency. So having those principles grounded on human rights, where you build people's trust is extremely important. So in areas where we've seen governments advancing, they have not just taken a siloed approach. It's not just one ministry that is doing excelling in data. It is taking a whole of government and a whole of society approach, putting people at the center of it. And many governments in this transformation have identified there are 2.6 billion people still not connected to the internet at all. Then in many countries, people don't have meaningful access to the internet. In many countries, people don't have affordable access to the internet. So how do we bring these people who are not connected, so it's not digital for just a part of the society, but how do you bring the entire society? How do you include marginalized societies? How do you include vulnerable groups? So government who have thought about them and approached it in a framework in which everyone is included are the ones that really advancing forward.
Brilliant, thank you. So the principles of accountability and trust, really important, taking a cross-government approach. And I think you've raised a really important issue there when it comes to using data to drive things like AI. That data has to be comprehensive, it has to be inclusive, and make sure that all of society, that government has data on everybody so that the policies they're developing can be inclusive. And I think that's a real risk for some people and a real concern for some people that we're not getting that right, maybe everywhere. Thank you so much to our great panel there for kind of setting the scene. I'm coming over to you now in the audience. This is an audience who love data because they've chosen to come to this particular session. So, any questions that you have already on data? Who would like to kick off? Yes, we've got two close together there. So we've got the lady in the red jacket and then the gentleman sat in front. We'll take those two first, and then I'll come, there's a gentleman over there. So that will be the third question over there. So the first two here.
Hi, thank you for answering the questions earlier. So my question is about promoting participation. So for example, when trying to develop programs, targeted programs for, let's say, Black individuals, we have a hard time folks self-identifying. So how might we promote self-identification in the data space so it speaks to the trust, accountability factor, but how might we promote self-identification so that we can use the data to develop those targeted programs?
Brilliant, thank you. So the question I think there is around how do you make sure that the data is accurate, but how do you promote kind of self-identification in the data? Goes back to the inclusivity question. Who would like to, yes, Melvin, I'll come to you on that one first.
Great question, and the reason it's important is because if the data is improper or not acquired in a transparent or at least a volunteer way, then the value of the data is muted or diminished, right? The reason why we're even having this conversation about data sharing is because people have figured out that it's not always a good idea for me to share, or me and my organization to be sharing data indiscriminately, because I'm not sure exactly how people are going to use it. So putting the AI solution in front of the data management, governance, and basic blocking and tackling associated with data it can be very dangerous. Many of the enterprise customers that I work with are less interested in the innovation characteristics of the AI solution and more interested in ensuring that they don't go to jail by sharing data of people who did not volunteer that data in the first place or didn't volunteer it to be used in the way that it's being used. And so, I married a Canadian girl, and all of the people in my family are Canadians. She went to Ottawa U, by the way, so let me shout that out. And so I think in many ways, Canadians are taking for granted the fact that there is a data privacy and a data protection legislation that governs how data is actually going to be shared and used. If I'm in the US and I want to have my data support cancer research for breast cancer, there's very little that I can do if a researcher goes to a doctor, hospital, or clinician, or data broker and buys that data and then uses it, as opposed to me having the ability to regulate or distribute my data at my own will. And so I think the ability to get people to feel comfortable about sharing their data, which is what I think the genesis of your question is about transparency, making sure people know, hey, this is what we're going to use it for, and this is how long I'm going to store it, and this is what I'm going to not use it for, and who I'm not going to share it with. Because trust, as was mentioned by my colleague at the UN, is a fundamental activity associated with the deployment of successful AI or data-driven solutions. Absent of trust, you have a portal that nobody goes to, or a chatbot that nobody trusts because it hallucinates, or you have a traffic pattern management system that is driving traffic in the wrong direction because people don't trust it. So trust and transparency is a fundamental aspect to this idea of why people will be willing to share their data with the government.
Thanks. So maybe there's a job to be done in the government communicating kind of how safely that data is currently being held. That might be something. Gabrielle, did you want to come in on the question of transparency, or how do you get people to identify when they're coming, when you're gathering data?
Yes, and thanks for the question. What I would like to actually say is, yes, we need the data from folks, but what I think what Dr. Greer's done is turned that a little bit, and I would do the same in the sense that going out and making sure that people understand that representation matters. And so making sure that their information and seeing those gaps. And so what, some of the information that we've done in our space is that we have an inventory of the different data assets that we have. And we understand we have metrics around them. So we understand its openness and classification, we understand its the data quality, we understand, and if there are gaps, and one of the gaps could absolutely be the representation factor that you spoke about. We need to go out and we need to actually, bring about that awareness and say if you're not seeing yourself in the data, then the data won't be representative. And so bringing that out would hopefully, give that momentum for people to do that self-identification, to come to the table, to make sure. But of course, pairing up with Melvin's comment around the fact that they need to understand that there's a trust and that there's an understanding of what are you doing with my data and why.
Thanks. I know we've got four now questions, so we will move on. But just to say, again, you wanted to come in, and also Emma's very kindly doing a session over lunch on diversity in data. So if you've got more follow-up questions on that, please do go and see that session over lunch as well. Again, you wanted to come in quickly before the next question.
In fact, I wanted to touch on diversity because it's important that you don't design it for people, but design it with them. So these marginalized groups and vulnerable groups are represented in the whole entire cycle of data. So in decision making, they are represented as well. That's the only way you will see gaps. You will see blind spots in data.
Thank you. Okay, gentleman in front, and then we've got a question over there, and then two here in the middle. So, gentleman in front.
No, thank you. Good morning. My name is Mlindi Mashologu. I'm coming from the Republic of South Africa, Department of Communication and Digital Technologies. So I think the question for me is, at the core of data sharing is the approach of cloud computing. So I just wanted to understand your views in terms of the approach of government-owned private cloud, especially for the citizen data, critical citizen data, or if you approach it in terms of the public clouds, and if you do use the public cloud environment, so what about the issues of data sovereignty? Because at the core of everything that we do, we need to make sure that there is trust, especially when you handle the citizen data. So that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think if you didn't quite hear that question, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but the question is around your views on the use of kind of citizen data, whether you partner with kind of a private cloud provider or you use kind of a public storage area for the data. What are the implications there? Is that what your thoughts on that? So who would like to come in on this? Yes, Emma, over to you.
Start. I would say in Canada, in my context in the public sector, we have very strict privacy rules and security rules around how we use the cloud. So there's considerations around data sovereignty, security considerations. Like right now in my organization, we've migrated data to the cloud, but we've done so in a way that really meets some of those key cybersecurity considerations. So I think one of the important things I've learned around the journey, because I'll call it a journey to migrate to the cloud, is that people often underestimate the work it takes to move from basically the mindset and culture around working on-prem to on cloud. And to me, the bigger challenge was around shifting that perspective in terms of the way people worked. Also, in terms of people understanding the configurations and the challenges around using the cloud that's different from on-prem. I found that more as a challenge than following the protocols, because the protocols in my context are very well defined by the different security organizations and the Treasury Board. So we basically just follow those processes, and I would really invite you to leverage some of those materials, because they are available, some of them are available publicly, and you can actually see the directives, the policies around how Canada frames a lot of those things. I'll just stop there.
Thanks. And I think it's an interesting question because in different countries, depending on the levels of trust in government, some citizens feel more confident in government keeping their data. Others feel more confident in the private sector keeping their data. So it's a real interesting. Melvin, you wanted to come in quickly, then we'll go to the next question.
Yeah, I think the question in and of itself highlights one of the things that I think is most important is that there's a convergence between cloud computing, cyber, and AI. And so for the Canadian government, I think what we're seeing is we're seeing this communication across shared services and the Treasury Board and other areas where these things line up to ensure that there's this constant set of communication going forward. I will say, however, that it also identifies a risk area. So if I have my cloud data secure, following all of the great things, but then I turn around and create an AI solution, generative AI solution, that allows me to develop a prompt engineering strategy to compromise that data, now you can see that just because I have it locked up in a nice secure place doesn't mean that I don't have the need to be very, very careful about how it's shared, especially as part of a large language model that can be compromised via prompt engineering. So the cyber extension needs to be moved not just from enterprise to cloud, but from cloud and enterprise over into AI solutions too.
Thanks, Roman. So we've got 3 more questions lined up. There's a gentleman over there. Thank you.
Yes, so earlier in the panel we were talking about privacy and security policy not being the enemy of innovation. And I fully agree. I don't think that security and privacy has to be the enemy of innovation. But what I've unfortunately seen a lot of is poorly written, planned, or implemented security and privacy policy being the enemy of innovation. And so my question is, how do we optimize our security and privacy policy to help it, well, help innovation rather than hindering it? Thank you.
Thanks. Great question. So who wants to come back? Yeah.
The reason I said that, I work in a premier law enforcement organization in the United States. So law enforcement is completely focused on making sure that we catch people who commit crimes. And so one of the things that we do is we make sure, however, that we don't sub-optimize the need to catch people committing crimes by muting or diluting the legal frameworks that provide people legal protection around privacy and security. So I'll give you just a very quick example. When I got my job at the FBI, my office was occupied, the office next to me was occupied by another technologist. But when I got the job, they moved that person out and moved the chief counsel into the office right next to me. And at first, I thought, wow, maybe somebody's got a hidden microphone in my office or some cameras because they're concerned about what I might do. But what I came to realize is that person was trying to protect me from creating technical solutions that violate the Constitution of the United States, that impede our ability to be not only a premier law enforcement organization, but also to be part of following the rule of law. And so in a very real sense, the way that I tried to sum up the conversation earlier is that by being transparent and by being able to offer a real incentive for security professionals to be participating in the initial discussions for solution development, to ensure that application developers have a responsibility for ensuring that we close some of the security issues around the way applications are built, and that we ensure that security is not an afterthought after the solution is built, but part of the way the solution is built, means that we will be in a better position to innovate faster. We want to incur technical debt. We won't have systems that are untrusted. Did that help? Thank you.
Thanks, Mel. We got.
I couldn't agree more with you, Melvin, because oftentimes what I see is people take the view that, privacy, security, legal, they're going to basically stunt innovation and delay the project. So they wait till the end, and that's when you really get delayed. So from my experience, what I've learned is the more you can embed that process right in the beginning, and in ESDC, as we're building the data foundational pieces, we're bringing cybersecurity, IT is working hand in hand with us so that we can go faster. And we don't end up with surprises at the end where you find out that, oh, actually legally you can't do this in the cloud. So what I've found is the earlier you bring them in and you embed everything as you go, and require that horizontal mindset where you don't have just data people speaking to data people, but data people also speaking to legal, the more you can achieve in the art of the possible.
Thanks, Emma. Right, I think we might only have time for one question. So, sorry, it was already the lady there. Yeah, if you could get the microphone here as soon as possible, that would be great. If we've got time, we'll come to you, but we might have to hold it for another session. We'll see. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Heidi. I'm from the Canada School of Public Service, the GC Data community team. And I found the references throughout to trust really interesting. And I just was I'm wondering if I could get you to expand on your thoughts, especially when it comes to communities where there are earned mistrust, where there's an ongoing need to build back up to a place where you can actually get people to self-identify freely. And then I think that relates to my main question of the notion of data ownership versus stewardship, because I think as government organization, we're not true owners of the data that we hold. And so like, at what point do we quote unquote give it back, where we're not necessarily designing programs where we take as much data as possible just in case we use it, but we actually take what is needed, and we're empowering citizens to actually have control and knowledge over their own, of what data we hold and how we're going to use it.
Thanks.
So.
Sorry, we'll have to keep it, because we've only got a couple of minutes left. So to summarize the question, any more thoughts, deeper thoughts on trust? How do you build trust between the government and the citizens so that you can get to this point where they're happy to share their data, but also your thoughts on government as the stewards of data, that data, rather than the owners of that data? Gabrielle, you wanted to come in. This is the last question, so you can all answer very quickly if you would like to. Yep.
Yes, so I actually think, and I say this often, data takes time. I think we underestimate how much time we need to invest in data. People are curious about bringing the technology, getting the solution, getting the quick wins and stuff. But if data takes time, building that trust takes even longer. And so what we need to do is we need to, and it's been already said by many of the panelists here, we need to work with the business, with the client, with the citizen, with whomever, to be able to understand and to demonstrate, sort of in my scenario, the service that we're building. So it's the idea of let's demonstrate what the outcome and the output will be, so that we can demonstrate some of those needs and why we want to drive to that, so that we can start to build that trust. But it does take time and it takes dialogue. And around that stewardship piece, we're an agency of about 6,000. And somebody said to me, how many data stewards do you have? And we actually have data stewards for each and every one of our data assets. And somebody said, how many data stewards do you have? And the answer is everyone. Everyone is a steward of the data that they create and they own within the agency, so that they make sure that they provide the context, they provide the understanding, and they provide the knowledge with which they need to govern that information on an ongoing basis.
Thank you. We've got 1 minute left, so we've got 4 comments to make in 1 minute if you'd like to go, and I'll start with you.
Sure. So having the regulation and the policies in place builds that trust. And also I've seen in certain countries, they create these data governance councils that transcends the government as well, bringing civil society into it, because what is the guarantee? The current government might have very good intentions in getting our data, but what is the guarantee that the next government will use the data with the same intentions? So only way to mitigate that is having data governance councils that civil society is involved and goes beyond the government as well. And going back to the point I made, once again, when you design these systems, public services, it is important to get people involved in designing them, because people tend to own what they help to create.
Michael, 20 seconds.
I do. Melvin talked, to paraphrase, trust through transparency. And I think one of the things that will help create the trust with the citizens is around demonstrating outcomes and making the citizens stakeholders in the data. A good example is probably the city of Edmonton, who has done an outstanding job of putting a lot of data out to the public and giving the public use of analytics tools so they can slice and dice and see interesting trends in the data. That creates that trust from the citizens to know the reason the data is being collected is for the greater good. And so those are things that we help organizations with, is how we can use that data to provide a showcase to the citizens so that they become stakeholders beyond the folks that are in this room.
Emma and Melvin, anything to add on trust?
Just say, if you're collecting this data, doing fancy stuff with it, and you're not really improving the outcomes of people, then you will lose trust. So vulnerable people, self-ID, all that, if we're collecting all this data, and at the end of the day, people don't see changes in their lives, they're still in at-risk and vulnerable situations, then you will never gain that trust. So I think it's actually leveraging data to improve people's situations, their experiences, and their outcomes. That's what will lead to trust.
Thanks.
I'll stop there.
Final point, Melvin?
Data is not neutral. It has context. Make sure you're aware of it and treat it in a very nuanced fashion.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause for our great panel.